The chamber doors sealed behind me before I even reached my seat, and that alone told me tonight was different. I am Daniel Hart, the only human ever allowed inside the Galactic Consul, and I had exactly 4 minutes to stop a mistake that could not be undone. 600 delegates stared down at me from curved rows of light and glass, their eyes glowing in colors no human eye should be able to read as anger, yet somehow I read it anyway. The air smelled faintly of ozone, a sign their translation systems were working overtime, struggling to keep up with the noise breaking out around me. A tall delegate named Vos Kalen stood at the center podium. His species, the Threll, ran half the trade routes in this sector, and every one of those routes had a warship attached to it. He did not look at me as a person. He looked at me the way you look at an insect that wandered onto an expensive carpet. "The vote stands," Vos said, his voice flattened by translation. "Earth will be placed under quarantine status. A containment fleet will be dispatched within the cycle to enforce compliance." I stepped forward, and the murmurs in the chamber sharpened into something closer to laughter. "You have not heard my closing statement," I said. "We have heard 3 years of your statements, Ambassador Hart," Vos replied. "Charming stories about your species climbing out of caves. Impressive, for a species that only learned to fly 40 years ago. But charm is not a substitute for order. Earth has weapons capable of orbital destruction. Earth has no unified government. Earth has, by our own intelligence reports, over 400 active conflicts within living memory. You are not a civilization. You are a controlled fire that has not yet been controlled." Something in his tone made the chamber go quiet, waiting for my collapse. I did not give them one. "You are right about one thing," I said. "We have not been controlled, not by ourselves, and not by anyone else. That is exactly why you should not send a fleet to our system." Vos almost smiled. "Almost. Is that a threat, Ambassador?" "No," I said. "It is a warning. There is a difference, and I would like you to understand it, before it is too late to matter." A delegate from the aquatic Doru cluster rippled with amusement, her bioluminescent skin flashing patterns that the translator rendered as laughter. A warning from a species that still argues about which calendar to use. Laughter spread through the chamber like a wave, delegates from a dozen species finding humor in the same joke at the same time, which might have been the first thing they ever agreed on unanimously. I let them laugh. I had learned, a long time ago, that the loudest room is often the one about to be proven wrong. "I am not asking you to respect us," I said, once the noise faded enough for the translator to catch my words again. "I am asking you to be careful. There is a difference between a species that has not built starships and a species that has not needed to. We have spent our entire history fighting each other, fighting disease, fighting hunger, fighting the planet itself. We did not stop fighting when it became inconvenient. We adapted, every single time." "Adaptation is not a threat assessment," Vos said. "It is a bedtime story." "Then let me put it plainly," I said, and I made sure my voice reached every corner of that chamber. "Do not send ships into our system expecting a plea for mercy. You will not receive one. Whatever you send, however you frame it, understand that Earth does not know how to surrender gracefully. We have never had the practice. Please, for the sake of every crew member on those vessels, reconsider." For one moment, something flickered across Vos Kalen's face, some small crack in the certainty. Then he straightened, and the crack sealed itself shut. "Noted, Ambassador," he said, in the tone of someone filing away a complaint he had no intention of reading twice. "The Consul thanks you for your passion. The vote remains unchanged. The fleet departs within the cycle." I stood there while the chamber moved on to its next order of business, as if I had not spoken at all, as if my entire species had just been reduced to a footnote in a meeting that would decide our future without us in the room. I gathered my things slowly. I was in no hurry. I already knew what was coming, and rushing would not change the timeline by even a second. A young aide from the Doru delegation caught up with me in the corridor outside, her steps quick and hesitant against the smooth floor. She was younger than the others, newer to the chamber, and curiosity had not yet been trained out of her. "Ambassador Hart," she said, Why did you not argue harder? You had time remaining." I looked at her, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not anger, not fear, something closer to sadness. "Because arguing harder will not help," I said. "They have already decided what we are. Words will not change their minds. Only results will." "Results," she repeated, turning the word over like it tasted strange. "You should tell your delegation to review Earth's history files again," I said. "Not the summary. The full record. Every conflict, every disaster, every collapse we walked through and rebuilt from nothing. Pay attention to what happens right before we win, not just what happens after." She frowned, clearly unsure what I meant, and I did not have the time or the heart to explain it fully. Some lessons only mean something once you have lived through the moment that teaches them. "What happens right before you win?" she asked. I gave her the only honest answer I had. We stopped being predictable. I left her standing in the corridor, and I walked toward the transport bay that would take me back to the human embassy, a modest structure tucked between towers built by species who had been flying between stars since before my ancestors discovered fire. I did not feel small standing among them. I felt something closer to patient. Word of the consul's decision reached Earth before I did. By the time my ship dropped out of transit near Mars, the news networks were already running their coverage, splitting the planet the way it always split, half convinced this was the end of everything, half convinced it changed nothing at all. I remember the message from Home Command waiting for me the moment my ship synced with the relay. 6 words, nothing more. "We heard. We are ready." I read those 6 words 3 times before I let myself believe them. Ready did not mean confident. Ready did not mean eager. It meant something quieter and older than either of those things. It meant that somewhere in the deep coordination centers beneath a dozen cities, in bunkers built during decades when the entire planet expected worse from each other than it now expected from the stars, systems that had been designed, tested, argued over, and left dormant for years were finally being switched from standby to active. I thought about young Ade's question the whole way down to the surface. Why did I not argue harder? Because the consul did not need better arguments from me. They needed evidence. And evidence, unlike words, cannot be dismissed with a laugh in a crowded chamber. I closed my eyes as the shuttle descended through the atmosphere, past the clouds, toward a planet that had spent its entire history being underestimated by outsiders and by itself in equal measure. Somewhere above us, a containment fleet was already being prepared. They thought they were coming to correct a mistake. They had no idea they were about to make one. 3 days after the vote, I stood in a briefing room beneath the Atlantic coastline, watching a wall of screens track the containment fleet as it crossed the outer edge of our solar system. The room was cold, kept that way on purpose, because heat made people careless, and nobody in that room could afford to be careless. Around me sat representatives from every major defense coalition on Earth, people who had spent their entire careers preparing for a day none of them had ever expected to arrive. A woman named Grace Bennett led the coordination effort, her voice steady even as the numbers on the main display kept climbing. She had been a systems architect before the world governments folded their defense programs into one unified structure, and she carried herself like someone who trusted data more than opinions. 31 vessels, Grace said, tapping the display. Confirmed through long-range scanning. Formation suggests a staged approach, not a direct assault. They are testing us first. Testing us how? Asked a man near the back, his name tag reading Oliver Finch, one of the newer analysts brought in from the Orbital Monitoring Division. By making themselves visible, Grace said. A species that wanted to strike without warning would not announce a fleet this size months in advance. They want us to see them coming. They want us to understand the size of the mistake we made by refusing to comply. I stepped closer to the display, studying the formation pattern, the spacing between ships, the way they moved in wide, unhurried arcs. They think this is a show of strength, I said. They are not wrong. It is a show of strength, but it is also a mistake, because a show of strength only works on someone who has never had to build strength of their own. Grace glanced at me. You warned the consul this would happen. I warned them not to let it happen, I said. There is a difference. They chose the outcome. We only get to choose how we respond to it. The room fell quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens right before people commit to something they cannot take back. Response options are already loaded, Grace said finally. But before we run them, I want everyone in this room to understand something. We are not fighting to prove a point today. We are fighting because 31 ships are entering a system that never invited them, and every single person on this planet is behind the line we are about to hold. I thought about the corridor outside the consul chamber, about the young Doru aide asking why I had not argued harder, about the answer I gave her without fully understanding how soon she would see it proven true. We stopped being predictable. Bring up the outer defense grid, Grace said. Full activation. Let's see what 4 decades of quiet preparation actually looks like. The room shifted into motion, screens filling with diagrams I recognized only partially, systems built across dozens of nations and agencies, stitched together over years of cooperation that the rest of the galaxy had never bothered to notice because it did not come wrapped in a flag or a treaty ceremony. Long before the consul ever heard of Earth, our planet had already learned the hard way that waiting for someone else to protect you was a plan built on hope, not strategy. Every war we had ever fought against each other left behind lessons nobody wanted to repeat, and over time, those lessons stopped being separate national secrets and started becoming something shared, quietly, without headlines, without the kind of celebration that draws attention from outside. The containment fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter on the second day. I stayed in the briefing room for most of that stretch, watching the data scroll past, listening to the calm, clipped exchanges between analysts who had trained for a moment nobody truly believed would come this fast. Oliver Finch sat 2 seats down from me, his eyes fixed on a secondary display tracking communication attempts from the fleet. They are broadcasting an ultimatum, he said, adjusting his headset. Surrender terms, formatted the same way they were presented to you in the chamber. Compliance and reduced hostilities, or continued advance and forced containment. Do not respond, Grace said, without looking up. Not responding might read as an act of aggression, Oliver said. Everything reads as an act of aggression to them at this point, I said. Responding will not change their approach. It will only confirm that we are frightened enough to negotiate from a position they already believe is weak. Grace nodded slowly. Hold all outbound communication. Let them keep talking to an empty channel. The fleet crossed the orbit of Saturn on the 3rd day, and that was when the first real change in their formation appeared. They split into 2 groups, one continuing toward Earth on a direct path, the other curving wide to approach from what their sensors likely believed was an unguarded flank. They think we only have defenses in one direction, Oliver said, a strange note of disbelief in his voice. They think we are still fighting each other the way we were 50 years ago, I said. Scattered, uncoordinated, a dozen separate militaries pointed in different directions instead of one system built to work together. Grace allowed herself the smallest smile, the first I had seen from her since the briefing began. Good, let them keep thinking that a little longer. I watched the display in silence, feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite comfort, but was close enough to it that I let myself lean into the feeling for a moment. The fleet believed they were approaching an outdated, divided world, clinging to the last edges of relevance. They had no reason to believe otherwise. We had never given them a reason to think differently, because we had never needed to. That was about to change. On the 4th day, the containment fleet crossed the orbit of Mars, and the first vessel broke away from formation to conduct what their own transmissions described as a routine security sweep near the outer monitoring stations. It never reached them. The station's automated response triggered exactly as designed, a layered system built from decades of cooperative engineering between nations that had once refused to share so much as a weather satellite with each other. The vessel's systems went dark within moments, its crew given ample warning to withdraw, warnings that were, according to the recovered logs, treated as bluffs right up until they were not. The remaining fleet slowed. For the first time since departing their staging point, the containment fleet stopped its advance entirely, holding position just beyond the orbit of Mars while their command structure clearly tried to make sense of what had happened to a single, isolated, supposedly minor patrol vessel. "They are recalculating," Grace said, watching the formation hold steady on the display. "They will not recalculate enough," I said quietly. "Not yet. It will take more than one lesson before they understand what they are dealing with." Oliver looked at me, his expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. "You sound almost sorry for them." I thought about that for a moment before answering. "I am not sorry for the decision they made. I warned them clearly enough that no one in that chamber can claim they were not told. But I have spent enough time around them to know they are not cruel by nature. They are simply certain, in the way people become certain when they have never once been proven wrong." "And now?" Oliver asked. "Now they are about to be proven wrong for the first time in a very long while," I said. "And species like that rarely handle that lesson gently." The fleet resumed its advance 6 hours later, this time in a tighter formation, clearly adjusting their approach to account for whatever they believed had happened at the outer station. They were still moving forward. They had not yet learned the size of the mistake they were making. That lesson was still ahead of them, closer now than any of us in that cold, quiet room fully understood. Grace turned to the room, her voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already accepted what is about to happen and made peace with the responsibility of guiding it. "Full planetary defense grid," she said. "Bring everything online. It is time they saw exactly what waiting outside our door actually costs." The lights in the room dimmed as power redirected across the display network, and for the first time since I had entered that bunker, I felt the floor beneath us hum with something alive, something that had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Every screen in front of us lit up with new information, layers of tracking data pulled from systems most of the people in that room had never seen operate at full capacity. Grace's hands moved across her console with practiced speed, calling up orbital platforms, ground-based arrays, and coordination protocols that stretched across every continent, every ocean, every corner of a planet that had spent generations arguing about borders and finally, quietly, agreed on one thing that mattered more than any of those arguments: survival. "Formation approaching lunar distance," Oliver said, his voice tightening as the numbers updated. "They have adjusted heading again. Direct approach vector toward the primary orbital ring." "They are done testing," I said. "This is the real approach." Grace nodded once. "Then let's greet them properly." The fleet crossed the boundary marking lunar orbit, and the first coordinated response activated exactly as it had been designed to. Layers of interlinked systems built from technology no single nation could have built alone. Technology born from decades of competition that had, almost accidentally, produced something far stronger than cooperation alone might have created. I watched the display as 3 of the lead vessels experienced what their own systems likely registered as significant sensor disruption, an effect achieved not through brute force, but through carefully layered interference patterns designed over years by engineers who understood that confusing an opponent was often more effective than confronting one directly. Ships that could not see clearly could not maneuver with confidence, and ships that could not maneuver with confidence became vulnerable in ways their commanders had never trained for. "Report from the fleet's remaining channels," Oliver said. "They are attempting to reroute through secondary systems. Command structure appears to be issuing conflicting orders." "Because they built one plan," I said, "and that plan assumed a single, predictable point of resistance. We just gave them 5 different problems happening at once, and none of their training accounted for handling that many decisions in that short a window. The wide flanking group, the one meant to catch us from an unguarded direction, found no such unguarded direction waiting for them. Instead, they found a second layer of defense, stationed exactly where their approach vector intersected with a quiet stretch of space that had never appeared on any external survey, because it had never been meant to." Grace allowed herself a brief, tired breath, as the data confirmed what she had clearly hoped for since the moment this began. They walked into the exact gap we built for them. "You expected this exact formation?" I asked. "No," she said. "We expected uncertainty, so we built flexibility instead of a fixed plan. It does not matter which direction they come from. It only matters that we can respond faster than they can adjust." I thought back to the console chamber, to Voss Kalen's certainty as he described Earth as a controlled fire that had not yet been controlled. He had not been entirely wrong. We were a fire. But fire does not simply burn in one direction. It spreads wherever it finds fuel, and it adapts to whatever shape the wind gives it. The fleet's remaining vessels regrouped near the edge of the orbital ring, their formation now tighter, more defensive, a clear shift from confidence to caution. Several ships had drifted out of position entirely, power signatures fluctuating in patterns that suggested internal systems struggling to recover from whatever confusion had been introduced into their sensors. "They are requesting communication," Oliver said, glancing toward Grace. "Patch it through," she said. "Let's hear what confidence sounds like after 4 days of being wrong." A voice crackled through the room's speakers, distorted slightly by translation delay, carrying a tone far less certain than the one Voss Kalen had used in the console chamber. "This is Fleet Command," the voice said. "We request an explanation for the interference affecting our systems. This action will be viewed as a hostile escalation." Grace looked at me, a silent question passing between us. I stepped toward the console. "This is Ambassador Daniel Hart," I said. "I warned the consul that Earth would not respond the way your intelligence reports predicted. This is that response. Nothing more has happened here than what I told them clearly, days ago, in front of the entire chamber. You are not under attack. You are simply discovering the limits of an assumption." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I wondered whether the translation had failed entirely. "Your systems have disrupted 3 vessels," the voice said finally. "No," I said. "Your vessels ran into a system built by people who spent generations learning what happens when you underestimate an opponent. We have not fired a single weapon at you. We have simply made it very difficult for you to see clearly enough to justify firing one at us." Another pause. "The consul authorized this fleet to enforce compliance," the voice said, quieter now, less certain than before. "The consul authorized a fleet built on assumptions that were wrong before it ever left dock," I said. "I am asking you, one more time, the same thing I asked the chamber days ago. Withdraw. Report back exactly what you have seen here. Let the consul understand what they were told before this goes further than either of us wants it to." The line went quiet again, and for a long stretch, none of us in that room spoke, watching the fleet's formation hold steady near the edge of our defensive perimeter, neither advancing nor retreating, caught in the kind of hesitation that comes when certainty finally meets its first real contradiction. Grace broke the silence eventually, her voice low. "What if they do not withdraw?" "Then we will not need to guess what happens next," I said. "We will simply have to watch it happen, the same way they are about to." The fleet held position for nearly 6 hours, their communications quiet, their formation tightening and loosening in small adjustments that suggested internal disagreement rather than coordinated strategy. I stayed in that briefing room the entire time, watching the display, thinking about the young Doru aide in the corridor, wondering if she was somewhere in that chamber right now, watching this exact standoff unfold through whatever feed the consul allowed its delegates to see. When the fleet finally moved, it did not move toward Earth. It withdrew, slowly, deliberately, 3 damaged vessels trailing behind the main formation as the entire group retreated back along the path they had arrived on, past Mars, past the outer monitoring stations, back toward the edge of the system and whatever explanation they now owed to a consul that had sent them forward with far more confidence than the situation apparently deserved. The room did not erupt into celebration. Instead, there was a long, quiet exhale, the kind of relief that comes from people who understood this was never truly finished, only postponed into a different kind of conversation. Grace turned to me, her expression unreadable for a moment, before settling into something close to respect. "You knew this would happen," she said. "Not the details, but the shape of it." "I knew what we were capable of," I said. "I did not know exactly how they would react to discovering it. That part, I was watching just as closely as you were." Oliver leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "What happens now?" I looked at the display, at the retreating fleet, at the damaged vessels limping back toward a console that would now have to explain, to every species watching, exactly how a supposedly primitive world had turned back their containment fleet without firing a single offensive weapon of its own. "Now," I said, "I go back to that chamber." And this time, they listened before I finished my first sentence. Grace allowed a small, tired smile. "Do you think they will believe you this time?" "No," I said. "I think they will finally understand why it never mattered whether they believed me. The only thing that ever mattered was what we would do when they stopped listening." The room settled into a quieter kind of work after that, analysts reviewing recovered data, engineers cataloging which systems had performed as expected and which had exceeded it, a careful, methodical process that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the tension of the previous 4 days. But that quiet, careful work was exactly the point. It was the same quiet, careful work that had built the systems that just turned back an entire containment fleet without a single confirmed casualty on either side. I stepped outside the bunker as evening settled over the coastline, the sky calm, ordinary, giving no indication of what had just unfolded far above it. Somewhere beyond that sky, a damaged fleet was limping home, carrying a story that would reach every corner of the console long before I did. I thought about Voss Kalen's voice in that chamber, describing Earth as a controlled fire that had not yet been controlled. He had been half right. We were never meant to be controlled. We were only ever meant to be understood, and understanding, I suspected, was about to arrive whether the console wanted it or not. The transport ride back to the console chamber felt longer than any I had taken before, though the distance had not changed at all. I spent most of it reviewing the reports Grace had sent along with me, page after page detailing exactly how each layer of our defense had functioned, translated carefully into language the console could not dismiss as exaggeration or bluff. When I stepped through the chamber doors this time, the murmurs that greeted me were different, quieter, less certain. Delegates who had laughed 4 days earlier now watched me with the careful attention of people trying to decide whether they had misjudged something important. Voss Kalen stood at the podium again, though his posture had changed in ways I doubt he realized. He no longer looked at me the way you look at an insect on a carpet. He looked at me the way you look at a door you are not sure you want to open. "Ambassador Hart," he said, "the consul has reviewed the reports from Fleet Command." "Then you already know what happened," I said. "I am not here to explain it again. I am here to make sure it is understood correctly the first time, so we do not need to repeat this conversation under worse circumstances." A delegate from the Doru cluster, the same one who had laughed loudest 4 days before, spoke this time with far less amusement in her tone. "Your world disabled 3 vessels without firing a single confirmed weapon. Our engineers cannot explain how this was accomplished." "Because you were not looking for the right kind of strength," I said. "You measured us by the size of our ships, the range of our weapons, the number of colonies we hold across the stars. By those measurements we look small. We are small, in that sense. But you never measured what our species actually spent its entire history building, which is the ability to survive being wrong about almost everything, over and over, without disappearing." I let that sit in the chamber for a moment before continuing. "Every species in this room has a history," I said. "Some of you conquered your neighboring worlds peacefully through unification. Some of you evolved cooperation as a survival trait long before you ever needed to test it against real conflict. Earth did not have that kind of luck. We spent tens of thousands of years fighting disease, hunger, extreme climates, and each other, sometimes making terrible choices, sometimes making brilliant ones, but never once given the comfort of an easy path forward. We built our medicine in the middle of plagues that killed millions. We built our understanding of physics in the shadow of conflicts that forced us to either innovate or lose everything. We built cooperation not because it came naturally to us, but because we learned, again and again, that failing to cooperate cost us more than any of us could afford. Voss studied me carefully. You are describing a species shaped entirely by hardship. I am describing a species that turned hardship into capability, I said. There is a difference. You called us a controlled fire that had not yet been controlled. I told you then, and I will tell you again now, we were never meant to be controlled. We were meant to adapt. That is the one skill no other species in this chamber has been forced to practice as constantly or as thoroughly as we have. A murmur spread through the delegates, quieter this time, more thoughtful than mocking. Your fleet arrived expecting a divided, unprepared world, I continued. That assumption was built on outdated intelligence, gathered from a species that has always presented itself more chaotically than it actually organizes itself when the moment truly requires it. You saw our public disagreements, our slow diplomatic processes, our messy history, and you assumed those things meant weakness. They do not. They mean we argue loudly about small things so that when something large enough threatens all of us at once, we already know how to set those small arguments aside. Voss was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing something, deciding how much of his previous certainty he was willing to let go of in front of an entire chamber watching him closely. You are asking this consul to reconsider its entire assessment of your species, he said finally. I am asking this consul to stop making decisions about us based on assumptions instead of evidence, I said. 4 days ago, I warned you clearly that sending a containment fleet into our system would not produce the outcome your intelligence reports predicted. I was not guessing. I understood exactly what our planet was capable of because I have lived among the people who built that capability. I did not want this outcome. I wanted you to listen before it became necessary. The Doru delegate spoke again, her tone measured now, careful. If we had listened, Ambassador, what would you have proposed instead? The same thing I am proposing now, I said. A seat at this table, not out of pity, not out of fear, out of the recognition that Earth is not a threat waiting to happen, and it is not a primitive world in need of correction. It is a species that has already survived circumstances most of you have never had to face, and it deserves the chance to be evaluated by what it has actually done, rather than by outdated assumptions about what it has not yet built. Voss looked around the chamber slowly, gauging the mood of delegates who, only days before, had been eager to support his proposal without hesitation. Now, uncertainty moved through the room like a current none of them could fully control. The consul will require time to review this position formally, he said. Take the time you need, I said, but understand something clearly before you do. Earth is not asking for special treatment. We are asking for accurate treatment. If this consul continues to make decisions about species based on incomplete intelligence and outdated assumptions, Earth will not be the last mistake made in this chamber. We may simply be the first mistake this severe that survived long enough to correct the record. A long silence followed, the kind that settles over a room full of people forced to reconsider something they believed was settled beyond question. Voss finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the certainty it had carried 4 days earlier. The session is adjourned. The consul will reconvene once the full review has been completed. I watched the delegates file out slowly, many of them glancing my way with expressions I had not seen directed at me before, something closer to careful consideration than dismissal. The young Doru aide found me again in the corridor outside, her steps quicker this time, driven by something more urgent than simple curiosity. Ambassador Hart, she said, you told me 4 days ago that your species stops being predictable right before it wins. I did not understand what you meant then. And now? I asked. Now I understand that you were never talking about a battle, she said. You were talking about this exact moment, about making a species that has always been dismissed impossible to dismiss any longer. I looked at her for a long moment, feeling something close to hope settle where uncertainty had been sitting since I first stepped into that chamber days earlier. You are closer to understanding it than most of the delegates in that room, I said, Hold on to that. It will matter more than you realize, sooner than you think." She nodded slowly, then turned back toward the chamber, leaving me alone in the corridor, with nothing but the quiet hum of a station built by species who had just been forced to reconsider everything they believed they understood about the smallest, youngest, most stubborn world in their record of known civilizations. 3 weeks passed before the consul reconvened, and in that time, word of what happened near Earth spread across the galaxy faster than any of us on the embassy staff had anticipated. Grace sent me regular updates from home, tracking not just the political fallout, but the quieter shift happening in how other species began treating our transmissions, our requests for trade discussions, our simple diplomatic greetings that had once been met with polite indifference. I spent those 3 weeks preparing for a session I suspected would decide far more than Earth's status within the Consul. It would decide how carefully every other species in that chamber chose to examine their own assumptions before making decisions that could not be undone. When the session finally opened, the chamber felt different before a single word was spoken. Delegates who once whispered among themselves during my previous appearances now sat in careful silence, watching the podium with the kind of attention usually reserved for verdicts rather than debates. Voss Kalen stood at the center once more, though something in his posture had shifted permanently since our last exchange. He no longer carried himself like someone certain of an outcome. He carried himself like someone who had learned, the hard way, that certainty without evidence was simply another word for guessing. "Ambassador Hart," he said, "the consul has completed its review." I stepped forward, steady, unhurried, the same way I had 4 days into the crisis that brought us here. "The intelligence used to justify the containment order has been re-evaluated," Voss continued. "Findings indicate significant gaps in assessment methodology, particularly regarding species whose historical records reflect prolonged periods of internal conflict followed by rapid unification under external pressure. Earth's profile fits this pattern more closely than any species previously reviewed by this consul." A murmur moved through the chamber, quieter than before, more thoughtful. "In light of these findings," Voss said, "the consul is prepared to extend Earth full recognized status, along with a permanent seat among this assembly, effective immediately." I had imagined this moment many times over the past 3 weeks, and none of those imagined versions had prepared me for how quiet the actual moment felt. No triumphant fanfare, no dramatic announcement beyond the plain, careful wording of a species finally willing to admit it had been wrong. "I accept on behalf of Earth," I said, "but I want the record to reflect something clearly, for every species watching this session, and for every species that may one day sit where Earth currently sits, being evaluated by assumptions rather than evidence." Voss studied me carefully. "Go on, Ambassador." "Earth did not ask for this outcome," I said. "We asked, from the very beginning, simply to be understood accurately. I warned this chamber clearly, before any fleet was dispatched, that the assumptions guiding this decision were incomplete. That warning was dismissed as posturing from a primitive species unfamiliar with the scale of this consul's authority. I would like this chamber to remember, going forward, that warnings offered honestly, even from the newest and smallest voice in the room, deserve careful consideration rather than dismissal." The Doru delegate spoke this time, her tone measured, thoughtful. "The consul acknowledges this lesson, Ambassador. It will not be forgotten quickly." "I hope not," I said, "because the next species this consul underestimates may not respond the way we did. And I would rather this chamber learn caution from our example than learn it from a mistake with far less forgiving consequences." Voss nodded slowly, something close to respect finally settling into his expression. "The session recognizes Earth as a full member of the Galactic Consul, effective this cycle. Ambassador Hart will retain his position as primary representative. The chamber, for the first time since I had first walked through its doors, offered something resembling genuine acknowledgement rather than polite tolerance. It was not celebration. It was recognition, quiet and overdue, exactly the kind I had spent years working toward without ever being certain it would arrive. Afterward, In the corridor outside, the young Doru aide approached me one final time, her expression carrying none of the confusion from our earlier conversations. "Ambassador Hart," she said, "I have been assigned to the new liaison office between our species. My delegation believes understanding Earth more thoroughly will benefit future negotiations across this entire sector." "That is good news," I said. "What would you like to understand first?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "Why your species never stopped fighting for its place at this table, even when every signal suggested it would be easier to simply comply." I thought about the answer for a long moment, choosing my words the way I had learned to choose them over years of standing in that chamber, surrounded by species far older, far more advanced, and far more certain of their place in the galaxy than we had ever been allowed to be. "Because compliance was never our nature," I said. "Adaptation is. We do not survive by giving in easily. We survive by finding a way forward, no matter how narrow the path looks at first glance." That instinct carried us through everything our history ever threw at us, and it carried us through this as well. She nodded slowly, absorbing the answer the way someone absorbs a lesson they intend to carry with them for a long time. "I will remember that," she said. "Good," I said, "because the next time someone underestimates a species based on assumptions instead of evidence, I would like at least one delegate in that chamber to already understand why that mistake is rarely worth the cost." She smiled, something genuine breaking through the careful diplomatic distance she had maintained since our first meeting weeks earlier, and turned to walk back toward her delegation's offices. I stood alone in that corridor for a long moment, looking out through the wide viewport toward the stars beyond, thinking about the 6 words Grace had sent me the day the containment fleet first appeared. We heard, "We are ready." We had been ready in ways the rest of the galaxy had never bothered to notice, because noticing had never seemed necessary until the moment it became unavoidable. Earth had spent its entire history being judged by outdated assumptions, by outsiders and by itself in equal measure, and for the first time, that judgment had finally caught up to reality. I thought about Voss Kalen's words from that very first session, describing us as a controlled fire that had not yet been controlled. He had been wrong about the ending, but not entirely wrong about the fire. We were exactly that, a fire that had learned, through every hardship our history had ever handed us, exactly how to burn without being extinguished, and exactly how to adapt without losing what made us who we were. The consul had been warned clearly, from the very beginning, not to underestimate that fire. Now, at last, they finally understood why. And somewhere across the galaxy, in chambers and councils far beyond the one I had just left, word of what happened to Earth's containment fleet continued to spread, carried by delegates who would think twice, from that day forward, before dismissing a warning simply because it came from a species they had not yet taken the time to understand. I had told them clearly, once, in a quiet, steady voice, that no one in that chamber had expected to matter as much as it eventually did. Do not mess with Earth. They had not listened the first time. They would not need reminding again.